Hello and welcome. My name is Trish Smith, and I am Edelman's Global Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and I'm delighted to be here with you virtually on today for this special presentation for the Global Alliance for Public Relations and Communication Management members in celebration of the 2023 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Month. I'll be sharing some of Edelman's research, our proprietary research, and our fourth annual piece of research around business and racial justice in the US, although we know there are global implications. This first wave of research was conducted in June 2020, just weeks after George Floyd was murdered, and we did a second one in August 2020 and have done one each year since, during, or around the anniversary of his murder. So let's jump in on today. Let's prepare now to jump into the research. So delighted again that you're here with me and that I'm there with you virtually wherever you might be in the world. Let's talk about some of the background of the research. So this year, we actually surveyed 3,500 individuals from all backgrounds. We had about 2,000 adults from the general population and then 500 Americans representing various racial ethnic groups. So we could get diversity of perspective. If we go to the next slide. To give you some background about the journey we've been on, as mentioned, we've been doing this research since 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And there are some themes that we've seen, some trends that we followed over the course of the 4 years. So 2020, we found that consumers were demanding that business do something. There's been growing expectation since 2020 around that, but we know that consumers expected companies to do something. In addition to that, we found that they expected executives to say something and to be involved, to be anti-racist. The next year, employees said that an inclusive workplace culture was a top expectation of their employer. And last year, 6 in 10 employees said that they would not work for a company or they've left a company or an organization that fails to speak out against racial injustice. Let me repeat that. 6 out of 10 employees said that they would not work for or that they would leave an organization if, in fact, it did not speak out against racial justice. And this year, in 2023, we found that there's a huge executive disconnect that's blocking real progress. And there'll be more on that in a minute. So with this piece of research, we look at this disconnect a bit more deeply and a bit more in depth. So let's move forward ahead. And so what we found is that there is concern. There's concern about racial injustice across all demographics, across all groups. You'll see here from the data that extends across racial lines, even political lines, age, gender, as well as income. 69% of people surveyed say that they are worried or concerned about systemic racism and racial injustice in the US. And you'll see that's up 8 points from 2022. That's a jump since 2022. And you'll see here on the data on the bars that that's up 15 points for Hispanics, up 11 points for Blacks, 14 points for those ages 55 and older, which is a trend we see throughout the research, which is quite interesting, as well as a 10-point gap for lower income. If we go to the next slide. We also know that as there is an increased concern of 8 points from last year to this year, there's also a huge gap or understanding or misunderstanding or unawareness of how to address it. So we're divided at 81% in actually how to address racism. While the concern is there at 69%, 81% say that we're divided on what really to do to address racism. In addition to that, 57% of the respondents said that they feel that over the last year, the country has made little to no progress, or that in fact, things have taken a few steps back. They've gotten worse in some instances. And this is actually up 5 points from 2022 to 2023 in terms of the progress or lack thereof that's been made. On this next slide, we'll see here that there is no institution of the 4 institutions that we research in Edelman's annual trust barometer. We look at trust across 4 institutions: business, NGOs, nonprofits, and government and media. Again, that's business, NGOs and nonprofits, media, and government. And there is no institution that is trusted to address racism or that are doing what's right when responding to racism and racial injustices. And that's, as you'll see here, a change slightly over the last year to year. Business, however, is now distrusted, and it had some degree, at least 50% last year, but it's down 3 points. We go to the next slide. Within that context of institutions trusted or not trusted for that matter, we see that no business sector is doing well on addressing racism. We've outlined some here in terms of those provided when individuals have provided their responses in the research. And we'll see that the only institution that in fact is reaching a 50% level is the sports industry. Sports and entertainment being second. Those industries that from our research we found are doing the worst when it comes to addressing racism in their industry would be financial services and pharma. Financial services being the lowest at 33%. We also found in the research that there's this disconnect that I mentioned before, a disconnect between senior level leaders, the C-suite CEOs, and those at mid-level and associate level, which we're qualifying as associate level being entry level or non-managerial positions, and mid-level being just that, those mid-career. There is a huge gap in terms of what an organization is doing or perception of what an organization is doing or how they're faring as it pertains to a meaningful progress in addressing racism and racial injustices in the workplace. 60% of executives, those C-suite executives, said that their company is making meaningful progress. 28% of mid-level and 18% of associate level said that the company or their organization is making meaningful progress. Executives are 42% more likely to say that their organization is faring well or, again, advancing along their DEI journey to address systemic racism. So despite the fact that employees, those at the mid-level and the associate level, may not see tremendous progress in the DEI initiatives from their employer, despite what C-suite leaders may think, we know that there's real value, that there is real impact when employers act upon racism. And we see that here in this response with 80% of those surveyed saying that DEI initiatives in the workplace actually are an effective measure to address racism, which is on par with the responses given to those government actions that you see listed here. If we continue ahead, we know that there actually is real value and huge return on investment when you focus on DEI within the workplace. When employees see progress, there's much more loyalty, as outlined there in the first graph. They're much more likely to become employer advocates, encouraging others to maybe work there and others to be engaged and involved. There's a greater sense of belonging within the organization, and there's a real commitment to the employer. So if anyone asks what's the return, what's the value, this slide here provides some of that data. If we continue along, we've mentioned a couple of times the executive disconnect. The executives truly do get a reality check from this research. The gap between executives and associates is quite shocking and sobering in many regards. And executives must take a truly hard look at themselves and these gaps to address them head on now, urgently. If we look at this slide here, we'll see while the majority of respondents stated that their employer is still trusted to do what's right when it comes to racial injustices and systemic racism at 72%, this trust is quite tenuous for associates. There's a 20-point gap in trust with executives at 87% and associates at 67%. Again, a huge disconnect, which requires a reality check, a wake-up call. Employers must utilize what trust they have now to drive towards progress and racial equality. If we look at the next slide, for everyone, when we look at who's trusted, what seems like a straightforward mandate, CEOs have a huge hill to climb in this work, as they're the least trusted by mid-level and associates when it comes to issues surrounding racism and racial justice. Just 15% of associates trust the head of the company to tell the truth about racism in their organization. And executives are the only ones that actually trust executives. They're the only ones that trust the CEO. Instead, employees are looking to people around them, people like them, and those of racially ethnic backgrounds. And you'll see that at 47% and 37% here. We continue to the next slide. Executives are also much less likely than associates to see the benefits of a diverse workforce. This is another way that this disconnect manifests. And it's in the perceived benefits, again, of a diverse workforce. Executives are much less likely to say that they see the benefits of a diverse workplace. Let me repeat that. I could hardly even get it out because it's so hard to believe that executives are much less likely to say that they see the benefits of a diverse workforce. Executives are truly living in a different world with a 15% gap between executive and associates in some areas. Associates report benefits to their day-to-day experiences, as mentioned before, from feeling this sense of belonging to being more innovative and creative, truly understanding the value of DEI and driving innovation. And if you're a more junior employee, a diverse workforce also provides a more rewarding work experience overall. Next slide. In addition to this, we also saw that another barrier is language and even the definition of key terms. When we looked at how people define affirmative action, we see that shockingly, the majority of executives say that it's a quota policy when we look at affirmative action. And associates are much more convinced that affirmative action is a policy that allows race to be one of the criteria out of many in deciding around hiring or admissions decisions. Now, I know this is US centric and focused, but we know that there are trends that while there may not be the same legislation around the globe, there are implications and there are some similarities in other places. This definition misunderstanding, or even not even a misunderstanding, it is a falsehood, shows that there's a greater concern that if we don't understand key terms, we can't even align on what something means. How can we have a productive conversation? How can we drive real, meaningful progress? In addition to that, we see that executives are most likely to say that changing the attitudes of people of color who are racist is a bigger challenge than to addressing the challenges or the attitudes of racist systems, with 65% saying that's the biggest challenge. So let me repeat that. If you see here, the majority of individuals say that the issue is in fact with people, not with the systems. That the challenge at hand is actually changing the racist attitudes of individuals rather than dismantling some of the systems that are inherently racist. We also saw that when we talk about language and conversation and misunderstandings or perceptions, that there's also another disconnect when we look at the ability to even have the discussions. Executives are also the most likely to say that they are uncomfortable when talking about race or racial issues for fear that they may say something that's seen as racist. Sure, one could say that executives have more to lose or face greater scrutiny, but executives are the ones that need to be leading the way and needing to be transparent about their own vulnerabilities, their own journey. And our data suggests that they are failing horribly. Nearly 1 in 2 mid-level employees and associates also agree at nearly 50%, which signals a greater challenge. Again, how can we solve the systemic issues of racism or make progress when people are uncomfortable even having conversations out of fear or because of fear of getting it wrong? When we look here, we see that executives also fail to operationalize meaningful change, which may not be a surprise if the survey shows us that they may not see the value. They're failing because it shows that they're not really looking at these areas of focus. They're not investing the time, the resources, the money that's necessary to drive change. They're not communicating what they're doing on an ongoing basis. They're not making racial inequity or inequality a real priority or business imperative. And they're not staying true to their values and who they are, and not succumbing to pressure that they may receive from internal or external forces. To put it simply, addressing racism and dismantling racist systems are a must. This work is absolutely necessary. Consumers or customers, as well as employees, are demanding that employers take action now. Organizations must own this responsibility and continue to deliver upon their promises. And how can they do that? There are several ways that are outlined in the research. We will provide this full research link to you. We'll make sure that it's available for you to peruse the research on your own, but very quickly to go through it. We know there's several things that the respondents said must happen. One, employers must focus on ensuring that there's diversity at all levels around or across the organization, all functions, all levels, top down and bottom up. That there must be diversity as well as within their organization on the board. Next slide. We also know that they have to enforce pay equity, that there must be pay equity along racial and ethnic lines. In addition to that, organizations must review their practices, their policies to make sure that there is no bias present in their organization or in that process of hiring and promotions. In addition to that, employers must have safe spaces for conversation. We know from the research that employees trust people like themselves the most, and they desire conversation and community, and organizations have to provide the infrastructure and the opportunity to have those conversations. Hence the imperative necessity of dedicating time to resource groups or of hosting global town halls or conversations. Like we talked about earlier, the fact that we can't agree upon key terms or have shared understanding poses an ongoing challenge. And as we've seen in these topics and other arenas, the employer is expected to play a major role in providing reliable information to address racism and racial injustice. On a topic like what D&I really is at 73%, or around affirmative action at 70%, or again, in providing training at 68%. Next slide. We also know, as we said before, that there is an expectation that's not being met. In fact, 62% of respondents stated that companies are doing a mediocre job or even worse in living up to their promises to address racism internally and externally. We all saw those amazing commitments and these lengthy promises that were made in 2020. Where are they now? What's been fulfilled? What goals have been met? We see here in this score that's up 8 points from 2022 in terms of the progress being made. A 12-point jump for Black respondents and a 10-point jump for Republicans and independents. It's clear. Again, companies are not meeting the mark. They're not fulfilling their commitments, and goals of any kind fall apart when they're done as a knee-jerk reaction or a performative act, rather than real commitment and involvement and support from leaders. Employees want, they expect, and they need change, and they need the promises that have been made fulfilled. And the role of the executive in all of this is clear. So if we look now to our follow-up, our last slide that sort of summarizes all of our takeaways. Again, we've done this research for over 4 years now, or 4 years now. And we know from this research this year that executives are key to the problem and to the solution. They hold the keys to this work, to really driving change. This report is largely a story about leadership and the lack thereof in this matter. Executives are, again, in the seat to drive. And so if we look here, we have to hold CEOs accountable. Two, we have to establish a shared understanding about key terms about what racial justice really is, what the term DEI means, what affirmative action means. We also have to empower voices within our organizations to share their experiences, to share their perspectives, to be able to have honest and frank conversations. And we also have to show the bottom line impact, the benefits of this work, that there is real impact. And the head of the company needs to hold everyone accountable to be a part of this themselves and everyone to be a part of this work. It's imperative to the functionality, to the progress, and to the success of any organization. So now I know we're going to have a few questions. As you've heard all this data, there was a lot there. I know it was jam-packed full of numbers. I hope that you gleaned something from it. And I also hope that you take time in your leisure to really dig into it a little bit more in depth. But now we have a couple of questions that Denise is going to pose.
Hi, thank you, Trish. Lovely to see you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And again, thank you, Trish, for sharing this very, very important research. We know that racial justice is a big issue impacting all of us and every institution. Can you tell us a little bit more about why this research is important to communicators and public relations executives in particular?
It's such a good question. I know some of you may be watching this and wondering if you're on the right Zoom, perhaps, or watching the right video in terms of the focus and the subject matter. And we just wanted to make sure, one, we shared it, the research is timely and topical, but also it's critically important for communicators and public relations executives because you are the ones that are providing the communications to diverse audiences. You are the ones who are crafting the messages. You're the ones who are identifying the voices to share the messages. And so the understanding of the expectations around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging and other topics surrounding how we create spaces in which everyone feels that they are welcome, valued, and appreciated is critical to a communicator. Those you have an amazing position you sit in also to be an advocate for and to be a counselor to your leaders to help them understand why these topics are important to communicate on, around, or about.
Thank you, Trish. You talked a little bit up front that this research was conducted in the United States, and mentioned that there are global implications to these findings. How do you see those findings resonating elsewhere around the globe?
Right. We know that diversity means different things around the globe, but we do know that George Floyd's murder sparked a global reckoning in which individuals around the globe, no matter where you might live, where you might be from, right, that it sparked conversations and people began looking around them to see where there are inequalities and inequities. And so we know that the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion has continued to evolve and expand beyond US borders. And so while this research was conducted in the US with the US audience, we know that there are some similarities. We know that there are some unified thinking and thoughts based upon what we've seen and witnessed and what we're hearing in other parts around the globe. So again, not apples to apples in terms of the pool being global, but we do know that there are trends based upon what we're hearing, seeing from even our clients at Edelman, but also just being a global citizen and seeing, hearing, and knowing what's happening.
Yeah, thanks. It really does continue to be a very challenging time around the world and in our various regions and cities. What advice would you give to our Global Alliance members who are watching and looking to help? What are some of, again, those day-to-day actions that people can take to address racism and racial injustice in the workplace and in their communities?
So this is like my favorite question of the day because people often ask, what can I do? That they think it is just the CEO responsibility. And our research shows that it is, in fact, an important part of the CEO's role and necessary, but it really is everyone's work each and every day. And so one of the first things you can do is to actually actively create a space to be inclusive and where everyone does feel that they are a part of your team, your department, your office, the organization. And so you can do that by, I always say, just even saying a hello, right? Being welcoming in how you even interact with those that you may not even work with directly, but are part of your organization. So modeling behavior of inclusion, If you are a leader leading a team, whether it's, again, 2 people or 200 people, that you're being intentional in terms of being inclusive in how you manage your meetings and how you identify who will be a part of certain teams or given certain assignments. Are you looking beyond the usual suspects to identify those who can serve in different roles and capacities? Are you becoming more knowledgeable and aware yourself? So actively learning. Oftentimes we'll hear the word culturally competent, and not everyone can be fully competent about someone else's culture, but you can be culturally curious. And so what steps are you taking to actively learn more? What are you reading? Where are you going? Who are you talking to within your organization or beyond to learn more about others' lived experience aside from yours so that you can learn more? That's another thing that you can do. I would also say being a part of, if your organization has employee resource groups or affinity groups or whatever you may call them, we call them employee network groups at Edelman, whatever the name might be, the communities that have been developed to provide a space for those who may be of a certain background or group and allies. So being part of those groups so that you can be a very present and visible ally in the work. So those are just a few things that I would say that individuals can do within their day-to-day work and in their interactions with colleagues.
Thanks, Trish. Thank you for arming us all with all the actions that we can take on a daily basis. This was incredibly helpful research.
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. I joined you last year, and I'm excited that I was able to do it yet again. I hope you found the research interesting. Again, while not a PR comms topic, it is a topic that is very critical to our work and our ability to do our work in an increasingly diverse global marketplace. So again, hopefully you spend some time in looking at it on your own. If you'd like to follow up with us and have any questions about anything you may see or hear in your review of the research, please do let us know. But thank you so much to Gladys and to the organization, and we hope to engage with you again soon.